Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Workforce Wednesday with the Greater Pensacola Chamber of Commerce. This event is a direct result of a survey that we sent out last fall, starting in October, to employers in our two-county service area for CareerSource Escarosa. So I'm Carolyn Fries, Director of Workforce Development with CareerSource Escarosa and the Greater Pensacola Chamber of Commerce. Kind of through a unique collaboration of the two organizations. I'm on the payroll at CareerSource, and I have an office here at the Chamber, and we all work very closely together on workforce issues here in Escambia and Santa Rosa counties. And one of the results that came out of that employer survey that we did last year was that employers are looking for more information on how to hire and retain employees, because turnover is huge. Employees are our number one expense in a business. We want to get good people, we want to keep them, we want to help them grow and stay with the company as long as possible, so we don't have to start all over again with somebody new. So as a result, this event today, we have Mr. Jim Howe, who is Vice President of Workforce Solutions with LandrumHR, who's one of our great PEOs here in the local area. And he's going to talk about, the power of people creating a stable workforce. So Jim, take it away.
Thank you. All right. Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Hope everybody is doing well. Please, this is supposed to be a little interactive. So as we go through this, hopefully you have some questions. Just stop me, raise your hand or whatever. I'm happy to talk about that. As you'll see, a little bit about my personal style is I love data and information. So we'll share some statistics and hopefully give you some perspective on why maybe you've been feeling some of the things inside your company that you've been feeling around either attracting and or retaining workers today. And then we'll talk about some strategies that we've kind of developed through LandrumHR that we think are a really great blend of putting process and people together as a way to help stabilize your workforce. So thank you, Carolyn, for the opportunity to come today. A little bit about myself. So I am a corporate vice president at LandrumHR. I do lead our workforce solutions service line, which is essentially our temporary staffing line of our organization. I've been doing this type of work for 20 plus years, helping companies really solve their problems around attracting, engaging, and retaining workers. Had the pleasure to work with Landrum now for the last 6 years. I'm just super excited about our own personal development within Landrum and the Workforce Solutions team, and hoping to share some just insights with you all today. So when you hear the word instability, anything come to mind? Like what resonates with you when you hear instability? Crazy, right? Yeah. Turnover. There's a lot of different types of instability. So we have structural instability. Anybody love Jenga, right? A lot of instability when you're playing Jenga, especially as you start removing pieces from the base of something. You have physical instability. We all go through personal development and highs and lows in our own physical strengths and attributes. Right now we're in the middle of political instability, aren't we? We've got a lot of changes happening. We've got an election year coming up. That's leading to a lot of instability and uncertainty. And we've got financial instability. We see this more and more today with changes in our economy and people's lifestyles and what's happening, rising cost of a lot of different things, causing financial instability. But what we're all here to talk about today is really workforce instability. And really, we've seen workforce instability for a while now. And so this first chart I'm going to share with you, if you're not familiar with it, it's called JOLTS. And it's put out every month by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And it's essentially job openings and the labor turnover survey results for our country. And this is a look back at the last 24 years since 2000 on kind of the changes that have happened inside of this. Top line is job openings, so number of actual job openings we have in our country. The bluish line is the number of people we're hiring. This is the number of people that are voluntarily quitting or leaving a job. And then this is our layoffs, so companies that are voluntarily reducing force. And so the interesting thing in all of this is that a lot of people talk about the fact that they feel like instability has happened post-COVID, but for me, the instability started happening actually back in 2018, the beginning of 2018. And I'll come back to that a little bit later in this, but why that's important, you'll find out in just a minute. But we had a lot of instability leading into the recession. It's something that I think most employers have lost a little bit of focus on, is that going into COVID, we were at record low unemployment. We struggled to find enough people. We saw the number of people voluntarily leaving jobs starting to rise every month because there was more competition for talent out there, and that's what was driving some of the instability. So there's two key things that drive instability, in my opinion. One is job openings, so the inability to fill the positions we have creates a certain level of instability in our organizations. And the second piece is the turnover that's happening as a result of that level of unfilled orders or open positions, or people having to work excessive overtime to make up the slack for people that aren't there. But for our purposes, we're going to really focus on what's happened kind of coming out of the pandemic. And really, it started to happen right around the end of the first quarter of 2022 is when we really started to see some seismic changes happen in all of these labor statistics. And it kind of peaked right there in 2022, where we were over 12 million job openings in our country, the largest we had ever seen, right? So there were record amounts of hiring that was going on. As a result, we were hiring a lot more people, and we were going through a period that a lot of people called the Great Resignation. Probably remember that, where there was a lot of people that were voluntarily leaving one job to go to another job because wages were improving, there was opportunity, there was high competition for labor. So that's kind of, in my opinion, where a lot of people really felt the high level of instability. So as we kind of look at where we're at today, so today we're still at 8.1 million job openings in our country, which in comparison to 12 million is a 33% reduction. So it feels like there's less competition. Reality is as you look at this trend line all the way back, it's still the highest number of job openings we've ever had, right, in the history of our country. So still great demand out there for people. Second thing is that we see our hires have kind of settled, and we're not hiring at the same level that we were hiring before, but we're also not losing people. So people aren't voluntarily leaving their jobs, opting for another job today, like we saw back in 2022. But we're still the interesting thing is we're still at record lows of layoffs. And companies that are downsizing or reducing headcount today is absolutely at a record low. So what we've seen probably over the last 18 months is more companies have really focused on, okay, we need to stem this tide of losing people to our competitors and to other like businesses that are hiring similar skills. So we've got to put a better focus on how do we engage our workers, how do we retain workers, how do we make that candidate and employee experience better so they'll stay more connected to our company and to our brand. The other thing I want to share with you is this is number of job openings per unemployed person in our country. And there's a great intersection going back to what I alluded to earlier. In 2018, right around here, was the first time in the history of our country we had more job openings than unemployed people in our country. Okay? Just think about that, right? More job openings than unemployed people in our country. What happens when we don't have an unemployed workforce to support the job openings? We essentially rob from Peter to pay Paul, right? So we're hiring away from our competitors, and we're creating this instability or volatility in the labor market. We went through a small period post-COVID where that kind of normalized itself just because of the mass layoffs that happened and businesses closing around COVID. But we've quickly come back out of that, and we're still around 1.2 job openings for every unemployed person in our country, which is about the same as we were leading into the pandemic. So if our perspective is different, right? We don't feel like we felt back in 2019, early 2020, but we are the same. We're facing the same things from a labor force standpoint today. Interesting, right? The other interesting piece of this is part of what's happened coming out of the pandemic is because wages have increased, employers have become more flexible, we have actually attracted more people into our labor force. However, we're as you saw, we've got 8 million job openings. So the job openings that we have today far exceed where we were leading into the pandemic. We just have more people now in our labor force, and so that ratio of unemployed workers to job openings still is the same. So as I talked about, the fact that there's two elements to instability, right? One is the ability to fill the openings and the jobs that we have today. The other is to keep the people that we have. So I came across this chart that was put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it shows what the turnover rate has been for all industries for the last, since 2020. And as you can imagine, turnover was highest in 2020. A lot of instability. We've seen some focus on engagement retention strategies. In last year, average annual turnover for all industries was around 41%. There's a couple of industries out there that somewhat lead the pack and have about an average of 60% annual turnover in their workforces. And those are industries you might recognize, right? Construction, retail, trade, transportation, utilities, professional services, and leisure and hospitality, which kind of leads the group as far as the level of instability and turnover that happens in their organizations. So I share this for a couple reasons, right? It's a good benchmark to look at, your company and where you fit today in each of these different categories and how your organization rates against the averages that are out there. The other thing that I like to share inside of this is while the percentages here are averages, we tend to see the percentage of turnover for your more entry-level, semi-skilled positions, especially those that have task repetitive natures to them, be actually 2 to 3 times higher what the actual average is, right? Because the average is including all levels of people within inside an organization. So, a little bit of a bleak picture, or nobody surprised by this, or question?
It looks like it's stabilizing.
It is.
What you're talking about, so that we've come out of like the danger zones we've been in, and it's gonna kind of level off here, hopefully. If everything goes.
Feel like that, right? The other part of that is we're still in a really competitive market, right? We still have a lot of job openings out there. We still have a lot of companies that are trying to hire and attract talent. So there's still that kind of, what I'll say, supply and demand pull that's happening today that I think we just need to be aware of, right? And I think what I've talked about is what we've seen over the last 18 months is more and more companies have really leaned into how do I better engage and retain with my existing workers? How do I take more of the mindset that this has now become a candidate-driven market as opposed to an employer-driven market? And I think that's probably, for me, one of the most fundamental changes that I've seen a lot of successful organizations make is prior to the pandemic, they still felt like it was a very employer-driven market, even though they were struggling for people. Coming out of it, and now 4 years later, I think successful companies are realizing this is absolutely a candidate and an employee-driven market, and we've had to make certain accommodations, concessions sometimes, or other factors in order to be able to attract and retain the workers we need to make sure that we grow our businesses. So, why is workforce stabilization? Why does this even matter, right? So turnover's been around forever. Companies have fought this game over decades and whatever. But it's really important because of a couple of factors. First is for your existing workers. Stabilization or instabilization creates more instabilization, right? Or instability. So the quality of life of your current employees, they hold dear to certain things. Like they want to come to work and see the same people. They want to know what's expected of them every day. They want to feel comfortable in their environment, and they want to know that the world around them isn't changing every day. Right? So it's a really important piece of this equation. The second thing is there's a lot of surveys and stuff that have been done coming out of the pandemic that says stable workforces show up more frequently to work. They have lower absenteeism. There's lower turnover when there's not as much volatility in the workforce. So it's kind of the fulfilling prophecy of, good promotes good behavior, right? So the more good they have around them, the more people tend to adapt to what's happening. There's also a lot of data that says companies that have stabilization in their workforces outperform their competitors from a quality standpoint, from a safety standpoint, from a performance standpoint, and even from a cost and a profitability standpoint. So getting a stabilization or stable base of employees helps your company to accelerate your growth faster and to make it more sustainable in the long term, because ultimately you're able to start leaning into continuous improvement efficiency opportunities within your organization because you've got a base of people to build off of. So when that base isn't there, when you're always rehiring, retraining, recirculating people, it's really hard to move forward. It's kind of like the hamster wheel effect, right? So you're on the hamster wheel, you're running really, really hard, but you're not going anywhere because all you're doing is you're trading people out back and forth, and you're never getting the opportunity to engage them at a higher level, to get them to a level of proficiency or even drive towards efficiencies within your organization. So, any quick questions as we're kind of going through this a little bit? Okay. Yes.
I have a quick question on the subject. So I
Yeah.
get asked this a lot, or I get some kind of like uneducated, opinions of folks. Are HR administrators and certain professionals dealing with struggling to decipher through candidates that are coming into them? Is that also a whole nother process sometimes? Are you experiencing this? Because I hear about a lot of opportunities for candidates in the market. I'll even send referrals with folks, but it seems like them actually getting hired on, having a success rate is really low. So I didn't know
Yeah.
what's causing the disconnect where people aren't necessarily getting hired that are viable candidates for some of these positions.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I think a couple of things. Just one, I'll share my own personal feelings, and I'll share a story that we kind of ran into. So my personal feeling is that as a result of what happened coming out of the pandemic, we had all these job openings, and everybody was wanting to test out what is my value, what is my worth in the marketplace. And we had people just sending resumes out. And we got a couple of our recruiters here today. Like, how many people apply to average jobs? We get hundreds of people that apply to a job. So sometimes it's a bandwidth issue. Like, employers can't get through to the really good candidates through the weeds of all the other unqualified candidates that tend to apply to a lot of jobs. Just want to either say they did, or to see what their value and worth is, or to see if they can find a new opportunity. So that's part of it. The other thing is what we've also seen, and we had organization that we work with, a large medical services company in the area, that we sat down with about a year ago, and they came to us and said, hey, we're really struggling hiring people. And we said, okay, so let me go to my next slide here, because this will help you. So where we start off when we're looking at helping organizations understand why they may be struggling hiring or why they're struggling retaining people, we've built this model that says every employee, regardless of your role in any organization, goes through 4 defined stages. There's hiring, there's ramp up, there's peak performance, and there's burnout. And depending on the role, like, that curve and timeline can be as short as 90 days. If you're in a very entry level, task repetitive position, you may come in and within 90 days, you're burned out on that job and you're looking for something different, okay? And so through the process with this organization, we sat down and said, okay, you're having trouble hiring. Okay, what are you doing around hiring today? Like, what strategies are you using? And what we found is that hiring wasn't in HR. They didn't have a defined HR department. So the department managers were doing their own hiring. Well, they were simply posting a job on Indeed, waiting for candidates to apply to their job, trying to weed through those candidates themselves while they're trying to manage their department, train employees. And what we found is that one, they weren't great at hiring, and two, they weren't effective at hiring. And as a result of both of those factors, they were creating significant amounts of turnover in their organization, especially with people that were on the job less than 6 months. We did an analysis for them and found that over the course of the 16 months leading up to kind of when we came in and analyzed what was going on, they had a 65% turnover rate for their entire organization. So, like, think about, doctors, medical assistants, professional people. So we had a 65% turnover. And of that, the predominance of that was people that had been with the organization for less than 6 months. And what was contributing to that was the fact that they were hiring people They were bringing them on. They weren't giving them any of the support they needed to be successful. They were lacking training. They were lacking leadership and supervision. They were just lacking some of the basic skills to be effective in their roles and to contribute positively back to the company. And as a result, all the instability that was happening was creating more instability. Okay? So to the point is, I think that oftentimes there's organizations, while HR is a really broad field, right? There's a lot of different areas, and recruiting and hiring is a small segment of that. So sometimes it's a lot for one or a small HR department to take on all aspects of hiring inside of an organization, as well as managing employee relations and benefits and payroll and all the other factors that come into the HR department typically. So figuring out kind of where they're at today and how they're executing across this kind of continuum of a life cycle is a really important factor in really understanding how to be more effective at hiring and also being more effective at retaining your employees long term. So this is more of the ideal, right, employee life cycle where they come into the organization at a higher level of understanding either the job, the expectations, the environment, what to expect on a day-to-day basis, so that we can get them to a level of performance that meets expectations faster, hold them there for a longer period of time, but then really through our engagement and retention strategy, we recognize when burnout happens. And burnout happens for everybody, regardless of your role. The important thing is figure out when does burnout happen and how do we either retrain or reapply somebody in the organization or build new skills into them so that we start this life cycle over again, right? That's the goal, is this continuum of a life cycle that helps breed the improvement of a worker and the longevity of their life cycle within an organization. Yes?
Wouldn't you say that in that one curve there, within a great organization, right there, they were intervening and find out how come that person is declining.
Absolutely.
And give them the challenges and the initiatives that they need to continue in their career.
Yeah.
I don't know how long that time period is.
Well, I think it's left a little bit open-ended from a time standpoint, only because each job is a little bit different on what somebody's, I guess, runway is for operating at a level of peak performance. Typically, people that are professional, very accomplished in their roles can be at a high level of performance for a long period of time before experiencing some level of burnout. People that tend to be in very entry level roles that are very task repetitive, that they're doing the same thing day after day, like they can go through this cycle much faster. And to your point, the number one thing that we hear when we talk to employees about this is the key word that they always talk about is, I don't feel valued, right? Value is such an important component today of most of what I'll say our entry level to semi-skilled workers are. Value to them is associated with somebody meeting me where I'm at today, understanding more about my own personal situation, my own goals, my own struggles, and helping me to be able to communicate to you when I'm experiencing burnout, when I'm experiencing these things, so that you can help me to figure out how to then find my new opportunity, find a new challenge, find a new role within the organization, so I don't just have to leave the company. So it's a great point. Yes?
Did I hear you say in the desired life cycle that you hiring people in at a higher level
I didn't say at a higher level,
Okay.
at a higher level of understanding.
of understanding?
Yes, and a higher level of connection to the company, to the role, to what the expectations of the job are, so that they hit the floor on their first day or within that first week with eyes wide open. You know, in our industry specifically, it's very common for temporary employees to show up on the first day at a new company and have no idea what they're there for. A recruiter called them and said, hey, I got this great job for you. You need to be there tomorrow. And they show up, right? We don't feel like that's the most effective way to help individuals become successful, to bridge this level of instability we're seeing today. And we see it on a smaller scale with a lot of other organizations. I talked about the medical company that we were working with. They were going through the same thing. People were showing up for the orientation that were just hired. They didn't have a lot of understanding of what the real role was, the expectations. They didn't know much about the company. They didn't know what their job was going to look like, who was going to be training them, how they were going to be evaluated. Like, all those things are really important today from that candidate experience standpoint. And if you haven't looked back today, my word of, advice to you all is, if you haven't looked at going through your hiring process from a blind applicant coming to your organization all the way through the first 30 days on the job, go back and reevaluate what that looks like today. Get feedback from some employees that have recently gone through that experience and ask them, did they really understand who you were and who your brand was when they were going through the hiring and application process? And did that continue, and did that replicate itself as they onboarded with the organization? Was there a clear line of sight for them of what the next steps in the hiring process looked like, what the expectations were going to be once they hit the floor, once they started their position? Like, those are such key component elements to that employee engagement strategy, but it starts in the hiring process, and there's got to be more of an orchestrated effort at that part of the hiring phase, the hiring phase of this life cycle, to communicate more to the employees about the expectations, about the company, who we are, our values, what do we stand for, what's the expectation, how do they become successful in their job, right? That all starts in the hiring phase. And the more you push to that stage of that understanding and knowledge and not wait for orientation or onboarding for somebody to get that, the more successful you'll be long-term at keeping employees. Great questions, thanks. So what do we do with this, right? So we start with this employee lifecycle model. And because I've been really fortunate to hire some really smart people as part of my team, they've brought these other concepts around Six Sigma and lean methodology to what we do from an HR standpoint. Now, anybody who's in operations, maybe manufacturing operations, very familiar with both of these terms. And you're probably looking at them and say, well, how does this apply to people? Like, how does this apply to the HR side of the business? Well, what we've done is we've used Six Sigma, which is really based on domain principles and around data collection. And we've helped companies to analyze in their employee life cycle, like, where are they most vulnerable today? What's level of this employee life cycle? Hiring, like, do you have a lot of open positions that you can't get filled? Are you turning people over before they hit a level of productivity? Are you losing proven performers that have been here for a while, that are high performers that are now leaving the company for some reason? Or are people just burning out and then going away and you never hear from them again? So really important to understand where in that life cycle you're most vulnerable today, and why is that happening? And that is a great place to get started. As I talked about the medical company, right? All they gave us was, here's the list of people that have terminated or left the company in the last 16 months, and they just gave us that data. So what we had is we had the start date, we had the end date, and we had the reason code why they left. We were able to analyze and break that down into buckets, right? So when were people leaving? Why were they leaving? And the overwhelming number of people left through job abandonment or finding another job. And so they were very, very vulnerable for those things. And it was in that, what I'll say, that ramp up period of time that was in that 3 to 6 month time period that they were the most vulnerable. From that, we can now apply strategies. Okay, so if we know this is our most vulnerable population of people, what can we do from a process standpoint to change what we're doing today internally to make this different, to impact the outcome at the end of the day with something that's going to push us in a more positive direction, right? So that's the concept of taking Lean and Six Sigma methodology, applying it to the issues and the problems you're having around people in your organization, and coming up with new strategies and processes that then align with the vision of your organization. You create a level of visual management through some sort of reporting or tracking mechanism. You find the waste and drive out inefficiencies in whatever your processes are. You create standard works and then you audit it, right? It's a fairly simple process if you follow it, but it's a little bit of a foreign concept that has typically lived in the operational world. And we're trying to find a way on how to incorporate that more into the people side of the business, because we think that there's great opportunity to mirror both of those methodologies as a way to help you build stabilization in your workforce. Any questions, thoughts around that? So going back to our employee life cycle, right? So, and we'll share this deck out with you and you can kind of look through this, but at each stage of the life cycle, there's some common things we typically see that pop up, right? And so this just kind of gives you some, what I'll say, some triggers that may be happening in your organization in some of these areas that may be an opportunity for you to look at what you're doing and how you're doing it today in a way to improve or impact your overall results on, lengthening out that employee life cycle. And so there are some really defined kind of informational or data pieces that will pop out to you as you start looking at this within your own organizations. So, and just kind of wrapping up, right? So how do we bridge this gap, right, between instability that you're having today and where you'd like to be as an organization? And really the first is to determine whether you have the internal bandwidth yourself to apply against this. And to what we see, this is actually the number one deterrent from companies moving forward in a significant way and improving instability in their organizations, is they don't know where to get started, and they already have enough work on their plate that applying it to a project of this magnitude sometimes is overwhelming, and you just don't have the bandwidth or the talent inside to go ahead and try to figure some of this stuff out. But if you do have the bandwidth and the talent inside, start with just collecting data. And it really could be just as simple as, what's my turnover data telling me over the last 12 months? Or what am I getting from employee surveys and feedback? What are my managers telling me that they're hearing from, their entry level and semi-skilled, people in our teams? Collecting data, at least gathering that information, is a great starting point for just trying to understand where you're at today, and is there opportunities, right, for improvement. The second is, when you do go to implement changes, start with the ones that are going to have the biggest impact. So, if it comes out that, turnover is a big issue, you're losing people in that first, 6 months of employment, create some strategies, create some new processes around that part of your hiring process. Do a couple of test cases or test classes of individuals that you hire and follow them through that first 6 months of their employment and get regular feedback from them so that you can use that proactively to continue to improve what you're doing. Track and report your results. We talked about, visual management, when it's on paper, when it's in front of you, when it's shared with the leadership of your organization, it makes it real, and it gives you the opportunity to start keeping score. And it is important to keep score. We want to know at the end of the day, are we getting better or are we not getting better? And so by collecting the data, analyzing it, reporting on it, it gives us the ability to understand if what we're doing and the impacts that we're trying to have are moving in a positive direction. And the last piece really is that, as you find success and you start to have improvement in an area, go to the next area, right? Take on the next opportunity of highest value within your organization and apply the same principles to that. It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be overwhelming. And sometimes just small changes can have a huge impact for your organization on improving stabilization. If you improve, as an example, right? So the highest turnover industries were about 60% turnover annually, which is about 5% per month. So if you're able to reduce turnover in your organization from 5% a month to 4% a month, which doesn't sound like a lot, but over the course of a year, you've gone from 60% turnover to less than 50% turnover. And that would be a huge impact on your organization depending on the number of people you have. So thoughts, questions, comments?
Can you explain a little bit about how recruiters use frequent touch points to find candidates engaged?
Yeah. So going back to, I think, your question in the back about qualified candidates applying and kind of getting lost in the shuffle, it's really one of the other voices that we hear oftentimes is that candidates that apply to jobs very rarely hear any feedback whatsoever about their application or their submission. Secondly, when they do, it's not consistent, it's unclear, and there's not a lot of what I say repeatability to the process. So for us, thankfully, we have great tools that help us. We have a lot of automated touch points that we've been able to build into the candidate process, where it reaches out and touches candidates at certain intervals, right? So once they apply with us, they get an email with, here's all the important steps in the hiring process, and this is what you need to do first, here's what's second, here's what's third. When they go on an interview or scheduled for an interview, they get a reminder, a text message that says, hey, reminding you, you've got an interview tomorrow. There's an automatic follow-up after the interview that says, hey, how was your interview? How did everything go? We have found that by linking a more cohesive communication structure to the candidates early in the process really improves retention and engagement of that individual long term, because they feel that value. They feel somebody cares and is taking an interest in helping them to get a new job, to get hired on. So again, as you're going back to your organizations, as I offered, start at the beginning, look at what that application and hiring and onboarding process looks like. Are there opportunities for you to better connect candidates to your company and to your brand, so that even if they don't get hired this time, they'll still have a favorable impression of your organization because how they were treated going through the process, even though they weren't selected. And there's a lot of surveys and data and information out there about just that candidates are significantly more likely to reapply to your organization if they had a great experience going through your hiring process, even if they didn't get selected for a position. And I think that's the type of brand assimilation we all hope to have in a marketplace, where we feel like we do treat people well, we give them the understanding of what the expectations are, and that even if this isn't the right opportunity today, maybe there's going to be one in the future that is going to be a good fit for you. So, good question. Yes?
I know Landrum Staffing as a customer for 2 organizations. And the value you get from Landrum Staffing far exceeds whatever percentage of it that you're paying for their management, because there are a lot of liability issues and other kinds of problems that you run into. And if you're a small business, they were great for Community Health Purchasing Alliance and Healthy Start Coalition. You're a great organization.
Thank you. No, thank you. We do appreciate those very kind words. And this is not a commercial for Landrum. So, but, yes.
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the timeline from when someone submits, an application or wants to be considered for a position to, when the interview should take place or the hire date would take place. Like obviously I think it would vary greatly between organizations, roles, all of that, but what's kind of the expectation in the market right now?
So, as you can imagine, and chime in if I say something incorrectly, we're in a very now-driven marketplace. People apply for jobs, and they are applying because they want a job and they want to get hired. And their expectation is that I'm going to go to work as soon as I possibly can. And most times they're looking for who's going to give me the best opportunity first. So my recommendation is, and something that we struggle a little bit sometimes with the clients that we work with, is that we're really good at recruiting. Right? We've got a lot of different resources. We've got a ton of people in our database. We get all new kinds of candidates all the time. So our ability to turn around qualified candidates for our customers is pretty quick, usually within a day or two maximum. For what I'll say most general skills, for harder to fill and specialty skill sets, a little bit longer. But what we find is our customers typically aren't able to move at the same speed that we are, for a variety of reasons. So my advice would be this, is that if you set the expectations with the candidate, so when you have engagement with a candidate that applies to a job, if you can lay out for them what the expectation looks like and when you anticipate you're going to be making a hiring decision. If you don't feel like you're ready to make a decision today and that may take 2 weeks, let them know that. Ask them, is this something that if you're the right fit that you would wait for this opportunity even if it didn't start for a couple of weeks? It's kind of the respect factor that they're looking for in the process, really. And so the more transparent you can be with that candidate on the front end, the more likely you are to get your candidate of choice at the end of the process. And really, that's what it's all about today. The other suggestion I would offer is that, as you saw, we have a lot of job openings. There's a lot of companies that are also hiring. Hire more for what I'll say, other factors outside of direct experience to the job that you need. You know, there's a lot of transferable skills that people have developed over the last several years that can move or transcend industries. Also, how do they fit culturally? Who are they as an individual? How are they going to act or integrate with the team that they're going to be a part of? Like, those are just as important to me today in hiring as the hard skills or the experience level. And we still see a lot of employers that are looking for very, very, very specific niche skills in the market. And as a result, they're missing out on some really great candidates. So those would be my advice there. Yeah.
I want to say that I'm not in HR yet. I am a new grad. So just being on that candidate side, it matters when a recruiter or somebody in HR, the hiring manager, remembers that they were on the other side as well. It's kind of just being empathetic in a way and not counting someone out, like you said, if they don't have direct skills, but transferable as well. Yeah. So I just wanted to make that point. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
It's great. Any other thoughts, questions? Yes.
I was curious if there's kind of a sweet spot for turnover, because obviously companies hire people they don't end up wanting, and the expectations for entry level are probably not 40 plus years.
Yeah.
So is there like a sweet spot in a percentage?
I would say if looking back at the industry average chart, if you can be, below the industry average, and if you have a good understanding of where your turnover is happening and why it's happening, I think that most organizations should employ some level of top grading that occurs over the course of an annual year, where they're looking for opportunities to improve the overall quality of their workforce. I don't know that there's a magic number out there. I think it's going to be very specific to each company. But what you don't want is you don't want turnover to impact other factors of your business, right? So if it's not impacting those other factors, your ability to grow, your ability to outperform, company expectations for profitability or for quality or for safety metrics, then I think you're probably pretty good. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about communication around terminations within a company? Because I think there's a balance there when you're communicating that people are departing, that can be demoralizing. And there's probably a way to do it where it's not so much that way. Yeah. But if you go to an extreme and not communicate, then that creates uncertainty. And so can you talk about finding that balance and how to what are some best practices and communications around employees leaving?
So, I guess I'll make it a little bit broader and maybe come back and be more specific to what you're looking for. I believe that all of our responsibility as employers is to continue to improve our level of transparency at every stage of that life cycle with every employee that we have today. And so to that end, termination of an individual based on performance or based on attendance or some measurable quantitative element shouldn't be a surprise to the employee, right? And if you've got a strong cultural organization that leans into those same values, they're going to know who the underperformers are already. So they won't be surprised as much when Johnny's no longer there, because they know Johnny's been absent a lot, and Johnny doesn't do good quality work, and he's had a lot of quality defects in his area or whatever. As far as with leadership, I think that's a little bit more of a tricky kind of thing to navigate in how you communicate leadership changes. Again, my first inclination is to lean into it with the level of transparency that you're comfortable with and why the business decision was made to make this change, what the impact is going to be to the individuals in that direct area, and how the rest of the organization and even HR is going to be there to support those employees through a transitionary stage. So I found that if they understand a little bit about the why, they understand like what this means to me today and how this is going to impact me in the future, your ability to kind of minimize the disruption from that kind of starts to shrink a little bit.
Can I give you a little bit more specific, like, example of what, so in our organization, say pre-COVID, when turnover was lower, we would, if someone left the organization, a firm-wide email would go out saying, this person is, no longer with us as of this day, we wish them the best of luck, and, if you have questions, let us know. And so the whole firm, would be aware that someone left. As turnover increased, that became.
I understand, but you didn't want that broadcast out, right?
You don't
For
want
sure.
that email every day. People are like, oh, who's gone today?
Yeah.
So we scaled that back and we adjusted, and now the practice is a little bit less defined and a little bit less consistent. So we might email out a certain group of people, the practice leaders, and then they're responsible to disseminate to their groups.
Yep.
To make people aware. But what ends up happening is sometimes people don't know, people within our organization don't know that someone's left, and they find out in a way that's maybe not ideal,
Yeah.
And so do you have recommendations on how to communicate?
Yeah.
Like,
It's a great question. I'll just answer by saying I don't, unfortunately. Like, I don't have a great answer that I can just kind of give you and say, hey, here's a way. I will say that at Landrum, we struggle with the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Pre-COVID, we were pretty transparent on every person that left the company. Our turnover was relatively low. COVID happened. We went in a completely different direction. We're mostly all remote workers today.
Yes.
We don't see people at the same level you used to. You don't have that same touch point, right, to know if Sally's no longer here. We try to do our best to communicate through senior leadership and have them disseminate information, but we're not perfect either, right? I think there's just opportunities, and I guess here's my recommendation, is if you feel like there's, a little bit of a groundswell from the general teams, that they feel incomplete by not knowing some of this information, perhaps that's a subject to bring to your next leadership meeting and discuss. Like, hey, we're starting to hear some of this information kind of bubble up from the teams about them not being comfortable or not feeling in the know when certain individuals leave the organization. We've built this new process that we confine it to this group, and we've got to solve how do we become better at doing this. I think that would be my recommendation, and let them come together and figure out what makes the most sense within their areas. Yeah. Yes.
From a hiring and retention standpoint, obviously salary plays a role. And I think historically, any company would base their wages on local area, cost of living, Bureau of Labor Statistics. But now with remote work being so popular, you're now not only competing against local employers, you're competing against national employers, possibly even international employers.
Yep.
What trends are you seeing? What answers, what's your
So-
crystal ball say there?
It's a great question. I love this question. And actually, like, I started talking about this back in 2017 and 2018 when we saw, a disproportionate impact already happening with supply and demand. Here's what I say about this is pay is only one of the attraction options that you have available to you when you're looking to hire people. Pay becomes secondary in retaining people to how they're interacted with, how they're treated, and what their opportunities for growth and advancement, if that's something that's important to them, are with inside an organization. I think that and we work with a variety we work from nonprofits to, for-profit, large organizations, and you have to come up with a strategy for pay that makes sense for your organization. That's both promoting of who you are as an organization, what your brand is, promotes your ability to be profitable and to be successful and to grow your organization and to retain people long term. Right? It is not the only factor. And while we had the Great Resignation that started in 2022, there's a great term that was coined in 2023 called the boomerang effect, where all those people that left because they thought they were going to a better situation where they were making more money came back to the company they were working with. And I talked to Jamie at Saltmarsh, and you guys were a prime example. You had several individuals that left and came back to the organization because the experience that people have in an organization transcends what they're being paid. People need to be paid according to whatever their lifestyle is and whatever they need to pay their bills. But at the end of the day, the engagement, the recognition, the opportunity for growth, how they're treated by their supervisor, the communication, what the company stands for, all those things, your brand is way more important than what people get paid oftentimes, which is why we still have so many people that love being part of nonprofit organizations or being part of our government or being school teachers. It's the reward they get from doing what they do that transcends what they're being paid. And we as employers have every opportunity to create our own narrative around that, right? We're not stuck to having to compete solely on pay, and we shouldn't compete solely on pay. We should pay competitively for the skills we need to attract the right talent, to retain them long term, but it's far more important how we interact with them and what we do with them over the course of their employment with us that will lead us to retaining people on a long-term basis.
Or having boomerang back.
Boomerang back, right? So, anything else, guys? I just want to say thank you. I really appreciate you guys were great. I appreciate all the questions today. We'll share out the presentation so as you have a time to kind of look through it and digest it a little bit more. If you do have questions, please don't hesitate. Reach out. I'm always happy to help however I can.